Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. This is the first of 3 webinars hosted by the Holland Business Chamber of Southern Africa. My name is Johan Prins. We're focusing today on the impact of COVID-19 on sustainable living and sustainable food production and supply chains. I'm joined by 2 eminent guests, both with broad expertise in the industry. Matome Damagopa, the General Manager at Enza Zaden, South Africa. Matome, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. And Jaco Oosthuizen, CEO of the RSA Group. Now, Matome's organization describes itself as a vegetable breeding company. Matome, give us a quick overview of what the company does.
So Enza Zaden South Africa is a subsidiary of Enza Zaden in the Netherlands. So we're a group of companies specializing in breeding, production, processing, and sales of vegetable seeds worldwide. So in South Africa, we focus purely on the development of varieties, so product development, as well as then the sales and then the technical support then to the farmers where the varieties are concerned.
And Jaco, RSA Group, I've had a couple of discussions with you. I've had a look at your website. It seems that you guys do almost everything to do with fresh market sales, marketing, providing the infrastructure for the markets. Give us a quick overview of what you do.
Thank you, Johan, and thank you for the Holland Business Chamber for the opportunity. Yeah, Jaco Oosthuizen, I'm the CEO of the RSA Group, and we sell fresh produce on behalf of producers, and we service those producers in all 3 channels in South Africa, on fresh produce markets, in the retail channel, and as well in the export channel. And we're in the fortunate position that we've got world-class producers, and that we have a mechanism whereby we can service the producers' buyers across all 3 channels. And we're looking at 2020, and depending on how COVID's going to treat us, but that we're going to sell in excess of 1 million tons of fresh produce on behalf of producers this year.
That's substantial. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much both for joining us. So we're all in the middle of this, so it almost goes without saying that we're facing probably the biggest disruption to lives and production and distribution in our lifetimes, and perhaps in many lifetimes. We're on day 12 today of South Africa's lockdown response to the pandemic. South Africa joins countries around the world that have now taken these unprecedented steps to prevent the spread of the virus. The measures are designed to contain or mitigate the spread of the disease, but they've also led to unprecedented global social and economic disruptions, and a huge tide of human suffering. We're all having to cope in ways we've never had to before, with multiple interwoven crises today. So what we'll do in this webinar for the next hour is we'll focus on the immediate and the longer term impact of these multiple crises on food security and the food value chain. We'll look at the immediate impact of the lockdown. We'll look at the short-term projections, so what we're expecting for the next month or so. And then we'll try and do an assessment to the extent that we can see the far future of the likely longer-term effect on demand, on production, and on distribution. So Matome, I think let me start with you. When the lockdown was announced, what was the immediate impact on your business and on your operations?
So basically, seed is at the beginning of the chain, so it's an essential part of the food system, because ultimately, if there's no seed, then it makes it difficult to produce. So in the immediate, we're also in a fortunate position that we, being part of a group of companies, we've been able to learn from how the rest of the world has handled it, and that has been able to give us some level of leeway, at least anticipation, on how we can best be able to prepare ourselves. So one of the key things for us is around supply. How do we manage the supply to the farmers? Because farmers have continuous programs, so they need to maintain. But how do we ensure that, one, we are able to bring in sufficient seeds into the country, and then secondly, how ensuring the distribution to the farmers. So those were some of the things that we focused on. But in the broader scheme of things, you can imagine majority of our colleagues and team work outside of the office, being technical salespeople. So we've basically had to scale down all our efforts of our activities so that everybody focuses on working from home, because we also see the need to contribute towards reducing of the spread of the virus. So unless it's highly critical or essential for people to travel, we've basically taken a decision that no traveling, or unless it's highly critical in terms of the support to our farmers. But in turn, we don't want to carry the virus over to our farmers, and vice versa. So that was one of the focus point internally. And then now, if you go back to our logistical chain, we had to scale down almost to zero in terms of office activities, keep that to the minimal, and just focus purely on the customer service department, who then ensure that we are able to still process orders and be able to get orders out. So it's been really working from home and seeing how best we can work efficiently and smartly, so that we can heed the call by the government to reduce activities. As much as we are an essential service, we have reduced basically our activities to the minimum, but we are still able to service and supply our farmer needs. So as it is, imports are still coming in, and deliveries are still taking place, even in the far-flung parts of the rural South Africa.
Well, that's good news. Jaco, your life probably was disrupted a lot more significantly. It's difficult to be a market if people can't have personal contact.
Yeah, it certainly. We've got a reference in the business that there's no handbook written for this situation, and as the situation worsened in terms of where we're heading with COVID, and we got wind of the lockdown, we immediately implemented social distancing in the offices, and over the past year or two, we've invested heavily in IT infrastructure in terms of fiber connectivity, video conferencing, upgrading all the systems. So that stood us in good stead in terms of where we now. We're able to communicate across the business seamlessly in terms of the software that we're using. And we also have the ability then to communicate with growers or producers, and then in terms of having a visual impact, we have access to quite a sophisticated camera network system on our markets and on our floors. So it gives us a sense of being, in terms of being able to visually experience the market. But one of the biggest fears that we had to face was, potentially what happens if markets get into trouble and there's a lot of positive cases on the market, because social distancing is difficult. But I think the teams and the business unit heads and the markets and industry came to the party and really put in measures in place. We leveraged off our growers and in terms of their protocols. And thus far, we've been really successful in terms of gauging what's going to happen the next day. And also initially there was a confusion in terms of spaza shops and the informal sector that was also in lockdown. So as that progressed, the agricultural commodity guys got involved, and we really got it going in terms of them being allowed back to be able to be part of the supply chain.
Right. So at the moment, I went out for the first time during the lockdown yesterday to go do some essential shopping, and the shop was full of food, which I think is one of the things that has surprised a lot of people so far. Is the supply chain has not seemed to buckle at all yet. Does that surprise you, Jaco?
No, not really. We have phenomenal producers, world class in every sense of the word, that needs to deal with international standards. And locally, we've got a well-established retail chain, and our fresh produce markets still serve as the premier or principal price reference point where prices of product is determined. And it's a system that over decades have served the South African producer well and is very well established. So in terms of that, no, not a surprise to me. What did have an effect was when suddenly there were restrictions in terms of travel, etc., that could have an impact on logistics and getting product to market and getting product back on farm level or picked. But I think that was handled very efficiently by the sector.
All right, so we're in day 12 at the moment. Are we, if the lockdown should be extended for another week or another 2 weeks, and I don't think any of us have a sense of whether that might happen, but let's say it does happen, are you fairly confident that supply will be maintained, at least in the medium term?
Yes, I'm confident, and I believe that we will even get better at managing the supply chain under these conditions, in terms of keeping sanitation protocols high, making sure that we keep social distancing at bay at the markets in terms of logistics, and the producers are doing more than their bit on farms in terms of keeping the farms segregated from each other and making sure that we adhere to all protocols. So I'm quite confident that there will not be an issue in terms of supply. The only thing that could tickle us a little bit, if there's certainly some adverse weather conditions, etc., that can play a role, but our producers are widespread, so I don't see an issue in terms of fresh produce supply per se.
So that's the sort of thing that we would be coping with in any case.
Yeah.
If it weren't for COVID.
Yeah.
Matomi, you have a fairly broad view of the entire supply chain nationally. What are the key bottlenecks that we should be worried about in terms of food supply and food security in the country over the next, let's say, 3 months? What are the things that we should be monitoring that if something goes wrong, we should start worrying?
I think one of the key aspects at this time is around the program. As long as there's no interruption in terms of supply and in terms of labor, and farmers are still able to go about their activities, then that the impact should be very minimal. Because if you think of it, product that we are seeing today on the shelf was probably was either planted or was part of last year, sometime late last year, could have been 3-4 months earlier. So what we are seeing now is already things that have been planned long in advance. So farming in itself and production of fresh food produce is a long-term planning and a long-term game. So if anything, probably would be concerned about the second half of the year, if there would be any impact. Yeah. But as things stand, looking at the way supply is going, and the way that farmers are still able to sow and stick with their planting programs, then again, I don't see much area for concern in that regard. I think we should still be able to maintain. If anything, what you may see is some of the bulkier type of fresh produce, and if anything, some of the produce that has a shorter shelf life, you may see a slight reduction, if anything. But I think in general, there shouldn't really be a concern at this stage. If anything, if there is any issues around labor, I think that would be one of the things that would be discouraging, because if you can't pack, if you can't harvest, pack or process and ship, then that would be the challenge that we could face.
So in the short term, gentlemen, has there been a reduction in export numbers? So are we seeing an increase in local supply because we're not able to export as much as we would normally do, or is export and goods still ticking along nicely? I'm going to start with Jaco, I think.
Yeah, I think if we look at the overseas markets, obviously there's challenges in terms of lockdown protocols, etc. it seems like everybody, and there's an uptick in demand because everybody is sort of looking and returning to fresh. It's a basic, and we've seen some heightened demand in terms of especially lemons overseas, and it's the start of our season. So from a lemon shipment, it's been good, and prices have been very good. So there is, in general, potentially a heightened demand for fresh produce across all channels.
And are you able to deliver with air links generally cut? You're distributing it at the moment, I'm assuming primarily by sea.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting for some of the guys, whereby we would use commercial airlines to ship a pallet or two of high value product like South African kiwis. That's suddenly, not possible anymore. So you've got to go to the more traditional route and get it on a ship and get it to your customer. I think there's been challenges, but again, government has stepped in and is working hard with industry to try and streamline it, the way we've got to have staff on board to be able to handle the volumes. We can't fall behind. And I do believe that ports and government and the industry organizations are working very hard to be able to keep the logistical supply chain open. So yes, I think we've been able to ship, we've been able to produce. There's a very good crop. The producers are working extremely hard. Their labor is working extremely hard, and it's trying times. But I don't see bar any that we can't maintain our ability to be able to supply the international markets properly.
And in a situation where currency is weakening, we want the foreign currency. It's going to be important for society generally to be able to export as much as possible.
Yeah, it's going to be, and we've got world-class product. So yes, there will be a push to export, and potentially the demand will still be heightened in terms of fresh produce.
But Tommy, I want to turn to you just for a second. The thing about a crisis is we don't know quite what we're talking about right now, and in a month's time, and in 6 months' time. But farmers, producers must be looking at the market and asking themselves, will demand be substantially different for specific products in a year's time or in 18 months' time? And should I be making adjustments to those ongoing planting and production programs now? Are you getting any sense that producers are looking at changing their traditional strategies, or is it too early?
I think it's too early, but what we have the advantage is to look at the rest of the world or other parts of the world which are ahead of us in terms of this crisis. So what is interesting, earlier today I had discussions with colleagues in Asia, and they're already in countries like China. You're starting to see activities in similar type of activities like we are doing. You're starting to see slow and gradual startup of business and interaction with customers. So things are picking up on that front, and we see similar things in Korea. So there's definitely a startup again, even in those areas which were severely hit. So I think if anything for our customers or for our farmers locally, the thing is to look at what is happening in other markets which are further impacted by the virus. And if that's anything to go about, then I think sooner rather than later activities kickstart again. And so we shouldn't, if anything, we should see a delay, but we shouldn't see a complete impact in that regard, considering what we are seeing in other parts of the world.
Now, just to take a broader view, COVID is one crisis that we're going through now, but the agriculture sector, the food production sector in South Africa has faced a number of interrelated crises over the last few years. There's been currency volatility, there's been insecurity in terms of property rights and the impact that has on investment. There's been drought in several areas in the country. Have these multiple crises made us more resilient, or are they driving us to a point where the system can't cope, or is it a sort of a muddied picture in the middle? Jaco, I'm going to start with you with the difficult question.
Thanks, John. We're resilient by nature, and if there's one thing that I can say, all of those elements that you've mentioned, for our producers, that we live in we're not a subsidized environment. Our producers are not subsidized like their counterparts in Europe. And that's made them extremely resilient, and they compete in the international market, which has its relevant advantages for the product that we have locally to sell and to consume. So we genuinely have world-class products. So all of those elements just made us more resilient. It made us smarter. From a South African perspective, in terms of world trade, we're ideally situated from a logistical supply line perspective. We're sort of in the middle between the East, which is a growing and a massive market, and we've got a relatively short route to market to Europe, and then to North America. We also ideally situated. So from that perspective, I think we can see in terms of our producers and the plantings and the quality of product that they've managed all of these challenges that come at them. And I think the latest one in terms of COVID-19, again, they've stepped up, and you know what they've done in a short space of time in getting product back, in getting their staff safe, in getting everybody and all the protocols up and running. It's just amazing, and we fed off that from the perspective down the market and in the sales side. And our markets are robust. They are able to cope with these changes in demand and changes in supply, and we're very unique to some extent that from a fresh produce market perspective, it's a commission system, and we still prices are discovered every single day on the market, and it remains the premier price reference point for fresh produce in the country.
Well, I suppose that's the point of having a market is you distribute responsibility, you enable price discovery, and the thing should be more flexible than a command system. That's
Absolutely.
the theory.
Yeah, absolutely.
Matomi, Jaco paints a very positive picture. You've painted a very positive picture in terms of the robustness of the supply chain and the fact that people are taking a long view and a considered view. But let me take the not so positive approach for a second and say this is without a doubt one of the biggest economic crises that we've ever lived through.
Yeah.
We're looking at a greater recession than 2007, 2008. People are talking about a disruption the size of 1929. In that kind of environment, in any system, in any supply chain, there will be weaker parties, and there will be parties that are specifically at risk of failure. Where do you see those risks concentrating at the moment? Who do you think is going to have trouble in the supply chain surviving?
Maybe before I respond to that, just to latch on to what Jaco was responding to. If you look in general, farming in itself is you generally always against the elements which are generally beyond your control. So the nature of the industry is already one of challenge. So I think in general we have that inherent robustness in us as the agricultural industry. Where I foresee the big challenges, as it is, there's a lot of let me say medium to smaller farmers who are really running a tight ship, and I think if anything, that's where the challenge comes in terms of cash flow. How much reserves do you have, or how much reserves do they have in order to be able to weather the storm or weather these difficult times? Because if you look in general, even from a pricing point of view or from a revenue point of view, it's cyclical depending on the crop. Some could be a 2-3 years cycle, some is a little bit longer. So at some point it does turn, but there's not a lot of farmers who don't have the advantage to be able to withstand those few months or those few years, depending on the crop, to be able to come back up again. So I think that will be the challenge in terms of how much cash flow, the level of cash flow that is available in order to be able to weather the storms. Because in general, at some point it does turn, but the question is, does it turn quick enough for some of those players to still stay in the game?
Well, which gets us nicely into a pricing discussion. I have a question here from the audience. In the long-term projection, are you confident that prices in international markets will remain the same, or should we expect higher prices? I think before I ask you to answer that question, how long, Jaco, do pricing signals take to go through the market? How quick is that distribution of that signal from sales side into production decisions or distribution decisions?
Yeah, Johan, that's what I think makes South Africa quite unique. In terms of the fresh produce markets and the principle of supply and demand that applies, for me, those price signals are immediate. It's the beauty of the free market in terms of that it factors all of these constraints into the process in terms of the cost of getting product to market, and then the equalization effect of supply and demand taking place in the price discovery process. So those price signals are fairly immediate to the grower and to the consumer ultimately, because it's totally transparent. So, and that shifts day to day. In terms of the international markets, that's got a longer term, obviously, because it takes maybe a month to ship, or that market is a little bit more matured, and there I do see over time that I think to answer Leonard's question, there could be price increases in terms of fresh produce in the international market. What does help potentially is the exchange rate process that could keep it moderate. But I do see some stronger pricing over the longer term in terms of fresh product. And then obviously if there's demand coming in from other parts of the world, or supply, those prices will normalize and could also be deflationary to some extent.
Matomi, your view on pricing signals, how quickly they're making their way through the system, and what your expectation is, let's say 2-3 months from now. Are we looking at higher prices overall? Are we looking at deflation? Just the fact that we're able to ask both of those questions in one sentence gives us a sense of the uncertainty we're dealing with. What's your sense?
My sense in general is that in the short term, so if we talk 2-3 months, I think prices should be able to hold. If anything, we may see, I think in terms of, we may see a slight increase where the core produce is concerned. If there's slight scaling down in production, it's got major effect. Then we talk about main produce, whether be it potato or onions and those type of crops. But in general, where the niche products, I think that should stay more or less stable. But I think the big challenge will be more on the larger mainstream crops, because if there is a slight shift, has a knock-on effect on price.
And we're as a country, as a national market, there's a large proportion of population who are struggling to afford food, balanced nutritional meal to begin with. So there's some market sensitivity in terms of the reaction to price increases, especially of staples. I just want to see if we can link the two issues. You said earlier that the people in the value chain who are most likely to have a problem now are people who don't have access to cash or cash flow, so capital cash flow. If in the medium term a number of those producers don't find a way to make it, so supply overall declines, would that be a significant decline in supply, or is it marginal? Does it tend to be specialist producers?
What you generally tend to see is a shift. So it generally gets absorbed, or it gets rectified somewhere in the market. So the general hectares on a year-to basis remain more or less stable, but it will shift from from grower to grower. So if there is a gap in the market, most of the times it's filled by another party, or it gets distributed in the rest of the market. So general, and if you go and look at the production levels or the level of supply year on year, you don't see excessive increases. Some of the elements that I think play a bigger role is in case of climatic conditions. But outside of climatic conditions, I think the supply levels stay more or less stable. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, that there's a lot of planning, and farmers have more or less stable programs that they follow year on year. So in general, things remain more or less stable in that regard in terms of supply.
So if I can summarize, it seems like the system can adjust as long as it's not a climatic issue which affects everybody at the same time. Is that pretty much it?
Yeah, certainly. So if you look in terms of certain seasonal crops where you are moving, let's say, from the main production, maybe in the high veld area, moving more to the low veld, or from the bush veld in the case of maybe a fruity crop into the eastern low veld. If there is no cold snaps, then there's generally at some point there's an oversupply, because both production areas will be supplying. But if there's early frost, then you'll see a spike in pricing increases, because supply would have been cut short. But until the other area is able to kick in, and then the market stabilizes again.
Okay, so climate, not COVID, essentially. Jaco, I just want to get back to you for a second. You said earlier,
tongue twister.
I wish we should make a T-shirt of that. You said earlier that you're seeing a bit of a shift in terms of the preference for fresh produce. I have a question here from Andries Dievenage, specifically for you. He says, do you see any change in purchasing preferences of consumers for fresh produce? You've already sort of answered that question. Maybe just elaborate a little bit. What kind of purchase shift are you seeing?
Yeah, and that's the privilege of being involved in our fresh produce markets. And certainly the shift has been to more staple products, vegetables, potatoes, onions, and to a lesser extent initially, the higher value items like apples, which is in RA season, so it's well stocked. It was initially slow, but it's now starting to come to there's a better demand for the product, because everybody is moving to the extent that we need to be more health conscious, and they're moving to basics. And the beauty of markets is that there's product for everybody on the market. It is not just class 1 or just below, or export grade product. Is from export grade to lower grade. So I felt that the markets to some extent was rediscovered in terms of what it can offer, specifically when you have the restaurant trade and the hospitality trade that have basically dried up overnight in terms of the lockdown. So people cook at home, they move back to basics, and they would go and through the buyers in source a pocket of potato, a pocket of butternut, or bulky product, and then have it at home and do a lot more home cooking. So we felt that sort of supplemented that part of the market. So yeah, there's definitely some changes, and I also think that the guys the buyers that were in those different supply chains quickly adjusted and offered an Uber-style home delivery service in terms of getting fresh produce into the suburbs, into the townships, etc. That's a very, very well-oiled machine and a slick operation, and I'm actually very proud of how it operated and how it is operating.
You said, I think perhaps during the conversation we had just before we went live, your volumes have been surprisingly stable. So despite the fact that the hospitality industry and the restaurant industries have had to stay home, you've seen upticks in volume elsewhere.
Yeah, our markets are well stocked, but we did see an uptick in demand, and I also think this week we experienced the borders being sorted out and a higher volume of neighboring country buyers back on the markets. So that certainly is an interesting part, because I think South Africa is still the fruit basket of Southern Africa, and a lot of those buyers come to our markets to do their buying, and that supplies the whole of southern region of Africa. So it was very heartwarming to see those guys being able to sort their permits out, to sort the border crossings out, and be in a position to buy and take produce up north.
So there's a question, Matomi, which I'm going to pass your way, and Jaco set us up very nicely for the question. So the question reads: how big is the opportunity to increase intra-African trade at the back of reduced global air freight supply, and in some cases reduced port operations? Is that something that every time you look at Africa trade reports, it's always striking that I think less than 10% of African trade is with other African countries. We are still exporting most of what we make to other places in the world. Do you think that this might cause a significant change in distribution patterns in the region? Is there an opportunity? Are we seizing the opportunity?
If anything, I think it is an opportunity for more product to go into the African markets. I think also, if you look at just generally how our agricultural sector is organized, and you sit with a lot of larger scale professional growers, and at times like this, I think they're able to maintain that supply, and with that supply, I think in those gaps that our neighboring countries may experience, we would be able to fill that gap with local supplies. I think also Jaco already elaborated on that. There's a lot more after permits and everything has been sorted. There's a better flow again from our African neighbors. So I expect that to continue, particularly on the staple products in that regard.
All right, gentlemen, I just want to quickly focus. I had a look at the calendar, and I admit that I know very little about agriculture. So all of this has been a very interesting and rapid exploration for me. And I see that on the calendar, we're about to go into harvest time on most of our staples. Harvest requires labor. Labor mobility is not precisely what it used to be. Is that the biggest risk that we face over the next 3 months, is getting enough people out to harvest the crops?
Yes and no. I think there's a lot of measures that have been taking place, and also when you consider that most farming operations are running all year round, so there's a constant staff complement which is working full time, maybe moving from one product to another, but essentially within the same business. What has also happened in recent times is there's been a bit more focus on the permanent labor, so at least then they're able to also control and manage the sanitation on the farm. So that shouldn't in that regard, because I think there is at least sufficient labor. But also, if you look from a vegetable production point of view, it's all year. What will generally happen, it will shift from location to location, but I think where vegetables are concerned, we are pretty much in peak season for the greater part of the year, just in different parts of the country.
Now, there's a sort of a selfish perspective, which is we need labor to pick and to harvest so that we have food, but we also need to protect the labor. Yeah. How easy is it to keep people safe whilst harvesting in a situation like COVID? And I think I'm gonna start that question with Jaco, because you also have to run markets at the moment. So how are you doing that practically? How are you keeping people safe? So you don't endanger people, but you also don't lose access to skilled, trained labor exactly when you need the most.
Yeah, we are in a fortunate position that our industry organization are very strong, and we leveraged off those set of skills in terms of protocols, in terms of what's happening in international markets, because we got the lead from them in terms of certain of the protocols. We adjusted them, and our producers actually take the lead. They run world-class packhouses. So from a sanitation perspective, they're already up there, and we leveraged off that in terms of our local markets, and applied the 2-meter rule, and tried to get social distancing applied. We didn't always succeed, but in the end, some form of discipline kicked in, and we've got distances between our sales staff and labor, and try and maintain that. It's not always easy, but we get it right. Markets have and market management have also stepped in and heightened sanitation at entrances, and have daily cleans. And also for the Easter weekend, I know there's major sanitation exercises planned for markets. So in terms of labor, I agree. I think our producers compartmentalized their operations, and didn't allow movement from one farm to the other farm, and tried in that way to keep labor safe and healthy, because that is probably the biggest risk on a farm where you have potential in outbreak and you sit 14 days or a extended period without labor. So our producers are very much aware of it, and I think they've done if not everything, as much as they can in terms of being able to keep staff safe and healthy.
Matomi, your sense, speaking to producers around the country, is this something that they're having a difficult time doing? Are farmers communicating learnings with each other so that you only have to learn a lesson once?
The key word that comes to me is traceability. So
Yeah.
I think farmers have become, most farming operations, particularly in fresh produce, traceability is key. So this is already something that is being practiced, because at any given point when you supply a product to the market or even to the retail or whatever, you at least need to be able to trace it back in case of any risk that may, whether be it of contamination or whatever. So there is already measures in place to make sure that how the farm is managed, whether be it in terms of which employees are manning which part of the farm, whether for spraying or whatever. So I think the general structure is there. What has had to take place was just applying those structures a lot more stringently, and also also in terms of just educating the general staff as to what the impact would be. But
so
farming.
are we? Sorry, Matobi, I interrupted you. Please finish your thought.
No, but I'm saying the farming community in general is one that is close-knit, because ultimately it's all in the interest of the community as a whole. So there's generally a lot of communication between neighbors and so on, also in terms of sharing best practices, because everybody realizes that it's in the best interest of food security and supply that we share best practices, so that we can be able to stabilize and be able to maintain supply for the industry as a whole. So I think it's less about the I and more about what's in the best interest of the industry.
Jaco, I think you have a comment.
Yeah, I agree with Matumi. I think also what I'm seeing, some of the questions coming up on the live comment side, Johan, is interesting in terms of other challenges that could be coming our way. You said it's climate, not COVID, but you've also got natural processes, like in terms of the African locusts that started in Botswana. We've got commando worm outbreaks in the north, so that also could have an impact in terms of supply, and that we've got to be ready for. But that's sort of an additional process or an additional challenge that we potentially need to deal with in the coming months.
But the sense I'm getting, again, as an outsider, is that a lot of the sort of traditional challenges that the industry has always faced, and the tools that the industry has developed to deal with those challenges, are being repurposed quite effectively now for the COVID challenge. It's almost as though most of these problems you've seen in some way and you've dealt with in some way already.
Yeah,
Does that sound about right?
I think you've hit it on. You've coined it. I think in terms of that, certainly, sometimes you might think it's superfluous to be able to do all of those stringent requirements, but in the end, it's prepared us very much for a situation like this, and we only had to step it up in terms of areas where we didn't do it. We had to get back into it and do it to a level that is world class.
I just want to turn for a second again to the live comments, and this from Inej. I hope I said that correctly. And the question is: have you been asked dealing with any sanitation issues at ports for incoming or outgoing cargo? And is that included in the new regulations? I want to ask you about the new regulations in a second, but what's the situation in terms of sanitation in ports?
I'm sure that it's being dealt with, because all of, in terms of that, it's an essential service, and it is a port responsibility. So from a producer responsibility, all of the hygiene requirements would have been taken care of 100%. And before any product leaves, we've got a world-class accreditation system and operation, PPECB, that inspects all product going out and certifies it. And all of the other certifications have to be in place. In terms of the physical ports, I'm not in a position to comment on that now, but I'm sure that it's taken seriously in terms of sanitation regulations.
Matomi, you started off by saying one of the things that makes your life easier at the moment is that you're part of a global business, so you get to learn from what other countries are doing. How are we comparing in terms of the robustness of the system, in terms of the way price signals are being distributed? How do we compare with the Netherlands, for instance, the experience in the rest of Europe? Are we on par? Are we learning the same kinds of lessons, or are there specific differences that you're seeing?
So I think the stance which the South African government has taken in general is a lot stricter and a lot more stringent in terms of just from a general country perspective. But being in the essential services sector, and also looking at what the statement issued by the International Seed Federation. So there's, in that sense, I think we are all more or less in line in terms of seeing the importance of the industry and the value that it adds in the bigger chain. So I think, in general, I think it has affected maybe to a slight extent the way we handle our day-to-day business activities, but from a total supply point of view, I think very, very limited. And as I said earlier, we are looking in some of just in some of the other markets and discussions that I've had with colleagues recently, that you see the markets have already started, or the general activities have started taking place. So that's in that sense. I think we are more or less in line. I am every time we have these type of discussions, I'm pretty comforted in the direction which South Africa has taken, and the position where we are at the moment.
So, gentlemen, let me with about 12 minutes to go of the webinar, let me summarize what I think you've said so far. It's been a huge shock to us all, but we're coping very well. There's no reason to think that whether we stay on lockdown a little bit longer or we go in cycles of lockdown, but there's no reason to think that the system will not continue to cope. We really shouldn't be concerned about a lack of supply of food in the country. There may be some price adjustments, but you're not expecting anything that's going to blow us out of the water. Does that sound about right in terms of where we are at the moment? Jaco?
Yeah, Johan, that sounds about right. And just to add to that, I think if anybody wondered about the value of industry organizations, the likes of the Produce Marketing Association, Agri-SA, Agbiz, Potato South Africa, the Citrus Growers Association, the Citrus Fruit Producers Organization, they've really been phenomenal in terms of facilitating discussions between business, government, and have facilitated the process to a T. There's regular command center meetings They've communicated exemplary, and I have to say that they've played an enormous role in the fresh produce industry in facilitating our learning in terms of how to deal with this, and they've been phenomenal.
Matomi, it seems I can echo Jaco from earlier. There's a lot that we can be proud of so far in terms of how the country and to some extent the world has handled this crisis. Has that surprised you? How well people have been working together so far?
No, not at all, because I think we are striving for a common goal, and this is not an individual thing. It affects the whole. It affects the country as a whole, and as Jaco said, from an industry point of view, there's been a lot of coordination from Agbiz. So in general, I think we are all aligned, and we all realize that it's for the better good that we all cooperate and coordinate. I think so. But the other credit also needs to go to some of the decisions that government has taken, although some of them may be uncomfortable. But when you look in general, there's this a common theme, or common drive to say, geez, we are in trouble. This is, or we could be potentially in a lot of trouble, and we need to roll up our sleeves and make sure that everybody gets down and coordinated so that we can best deal with this for the greater good of the country, and also for the more particularly for this theme, for the greater part of the agricultural industry as a whole.
Now, I want to pick up on that. I want to use the last 10 minutes or so just to think about longer term impact. Take a breath from the current storm and think about whether this is going to affect the way we do business, the way we make decisions into the longer term future. And Matomi, I want to start just with that thing you said now about a greater sense of cooperation also between the industry and government. Do you think that sense of cooperation might translate beyond COVID into other issues that have been divisive in the industry? Do you think that in finding each other now, it might be easier for us to find each other in future on other issues?
Yeah, this has been an opportunity to get to know each other, because I think a lot of the times there's also a lot of, shall I say, misalignment in terms of not actually having in-depth understanding of what each industry does and what the value and the contribution is. And at a time like this, I think it was an opportunity for that alignment. So I think it should continue. Just on a lighter note, I recently had a conversation with one of our service providers who has been our service providers for a while, but in this whole process, I had to explain to them how the importance of seed. So as much as they've been our service provider for many years, so working close to our organization, but they could not comprehend or let alone understand the value of seed in the entire chain. But so I think as a whole, it has given us the opportunity to be able to have the right conversations and to be able to identify what the value adds are. And of course, this is not a stop-start process, because this will be ongoing for some time, but I think it forces us to sit around the same table and have those discussions. So certainly I see this as an ongoing thing, and if those in leadership can take the opportunity, then this could be a great momentum that can be taken forward.
The cliche about not wasting a crisis. Jaco, I just want to come back to you for a second. Some of the articles I'm reading at the moment, some of the people I'm hearing speaking, are saying that what COVID represents is also a challenge for globalization. It's a challenge for the concept of global supply chains and just-in-time production and supply. Is it? Do you think that people are going to be fundamentally reevaluating where they buy what and who they rely on?
I certainly think it will have an impact. I think people generally like to know where their product comes from, who produces it. I think there will be certainly a heightened awareness of specifically fresh produce and the value of fresh produce, and I also think it will strengthen our traditional supply channels, in terms of markets, in terms of our regional markets, where markets are being established in rural areas, and those markets in the past few weeks have shown enormous resilience in terms of being able to be well stocked, supported by producers, and supported by buyers in those areas that would normally not have a market available. And to see what's been happening there is phenomenal. And I think there was a little bit of a clip on SABC2 of these markets in Polokwane and Muketsi, Nelspruit and Valdriehoek. So certainly I think that will change. People will be much more aware of where product coming from, and making sure that they know where to buy it.
But Tommy, if we do find ourselves in a couple of months, maybe even a year or two of straitened economic circumstances, that is going to have an impact on consumption choices, on demand at a consumer level, at a retailer level. Do you have any sense of what kind of changes those might be?
Yeah, this is an ongoing discussion that we have, because if you look at traditional food consumption and the type of produce that has been consumed, you could almost categorize it along racial lines or along class lines or etc. But what you're seeing now is a lot more what I would deem global products. So there's a broadening of the product offering of the assortment that is being offered on all markets. So this, of course, has been influenced by certain retailers moving into the townships, but also from a global perspective, food channels and whatever, exposure to a broader range of products, and of course, organizations and seed companies like ourselves being able to give a bigger offering in terms of fresh produce and the different types of products. So I expect that to continue. I think at any given point during difficult times, there would be a slight decline, so slowing, and then from there, then it should pick up again.
Okay, gentlemen, we're almost out of time. I want to use the last couple of minutes to ask two questions. The first is, we've all learned quite a lot about our own businesses and about ourselves and about our teams over the last few weeks. Jaco, what's the biggest lesson that you've learned having to cope with this crisis?
Johan, there's a Spartan saying, and I think it goes like this. It says, the more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in battle. And being in the fresh produce industry, I think we've been trained pretty well. So evidently we're bleeding a little bit less in the battle. And for me, that's one of the takeaway notes in terms of battling COVID-19.
Matumi?
For me, it's around efficiency, planning, and organizing. So I think those three words, I think, resonate. There's a lot more reflection that has to take place in terms of just how we organize ourselves day to day. I think a lot more reflection and trying to actually identify what is the justification for certain activities that we're doing. Because you walk into, there's a certain way of doing business, but does it actually make sense? So I think at times like this, you ask those questions because does it really make sense? What do we need to change? What do we need to realign? For our technical and sales teams, we've also been asking the same thing. How better do we plan to make sure that you're still able to service and supply? So those are some of the key questions that I think most organizations and most leaders will also be asking themselves.
Yeah.
So reevaluate all of the old certainties, no holy cows, almost start from scratch and look at every single decision on its merit.
Yeah.
Actually think about the decisions that you're making, because we've sort of been on autopilot, but now it's a good time to actually reflect on them.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice description. We've all come off autopilot. So here's the last question. What has what has improved your mood over the last few weeks? What has pleasantly surprised you? I'm gonna start with the person who looks less uncertain, which at the moment is Jaco.
I've got it's a one-liner for me, and it is the realization to stay healthy. You got to eat healthy, eat fruit and veg.
Okay. But tell me what has pleasantly surprised you in this experience so far?
How efficient and how collaborative we can be when push comes to shove.
Absolutely.
That the potential is there. There's actually energy. It just needs to be harnessed. So when it's really required, then things can be done and things happen. This is on private company level, but also on government level. When you look at how things have been responded to, and some of the action and the swift actions that have taken place in the last couple of weeks.
Yeah.
All right, that unfortunately brings us to the end of our webinar for this afternoon. Matomera Mogopa, General Manager at Enzazaden, Jaco Oosthuizen, CEO of the RSA Group. Gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. You have left me in a better mood after the hour than I was going into the hour. And to those who watched, thank you very much for joining us on our very first webinar for the Holland Business Chamber in Southern Africa. We will be doing another one on Thursday afternoon at exactly the same time. Tell your friends, please join us again. And thank you very much for your time. Good afternoon. Have a good night.
All right. Thank you.